So much of what we have learned so far about supply and about demand is generalizable across different structures of markets. There are also some conclusions about the relationship between supply and demand that are particular to an assumption of market structure, which is perfectly competitive. And so, what do we mean by perfectly competitive? So perfect competition is going to be an assumption about how buyers and sellers interact in a market, and it is going to involve four primary sets of assumptions which are going to drive this larger assumption. So first of all, in a perfectly competitive market, there are going to be many buyers and sellers exchanging homogeneous products. And homogeneous here just means the same. So virtually these products are assumed to be identical, more or less, that if you get a can of green paint from Menards or you get a can of green paint from Lowe's or Home Depot, they should be the same thing. That may be a perfectly competitive market for just standard interior paint. And there's assumed to be many buyers and sellers, so there's enough consumers going to buy those cans of paint that we don't have, as consumers, undue market price. We can't tell Lowe's, hey, if you don't drop your price of paint, then I'm just going to go shop somewhere else, because another consumer would be willing to go in and buy that paint at that price. Similarly, there needs to be enough sellers such that they can't exert market power over us and say that they're going to raise the price of a gallon of paint above a reasonable value, because consumers could just say, okay, well, then we'll go to Ace Hardware, we'll go to Home Depot, we'll go to Lowe's, we'll go to Menards, we'll go to a local paint store in town, a Sherwin-Williams or something. And so this is an important feature about a perfectly competitive market. Related to this, if there are to be many sellers, then there needs to be no barriers to entry. And by this, we mean that whenever a prospective supplier or producer senses the opportunity for profit, they can enter that market, they can join the market, decide to produce that product, and be able to capture that profit. When there are barriers to entry, such as for a government-regulated utility, or if the price, if, for example, Amazon is able to sell a product at low enough of a price that it is below the marginal cost of production for other producers, and it wouldn't be profitable for them to enter, then that is not a competitive market structure, and some of our conclusions about supply and demand would no longer apply. Related to that point, I actually just kind of stole this point, is that there are no advantages for existing firms, that when there are advantages for existing firms, it places a implicit barrier to entry, which would then kind of damage our assumption about there being many sellers. And lastly, there needs to be full information on pricing. And so by this, we mean that producers need to act as if the market is perfectly competitive. And if consumers aren't aware of the price at one store or another, then they may say that, okay, I know what the price here at Menards is. It's a 20-minute drive to go to Home Depot. They may have the product for cheaper, but I need this product now. I don't know what the price of that product is. It could be higher. And so I guess I'm just going to buy this one here at Menards. And when consumers behave that way, then it gives market power to the producers. The producers are able to charge a higher price. And so once again, our conclusions about supply and demand are going to be different than they would be if it were a perfectly competitive market. So now returning to our assertion from a couple slides ago about the optimality, the superiority the greatness, right? The efficiency of that equilibrium price and quantity. Let's defend that a little bit more by thinking about how it actually benefits consumers and benefits producers. So it's going to be important here to think about the other definitions of demand. That demand is not only represented by that letter D, but use your recall here, see if you can already remember what these other letters are before I write them. But we also think of it as being represented by the letters WTP, and importantly here by the letters MB. So MB represents marginal benefits. And so it tells us how much benefits each additional unit that is bought and sold brings to consumers on the market. And so when that marginal benefit is greater than the price, then consumers are capturing value which would not have existed had that good or service not been bought or sold. And so when we think of the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity, remember these are real values that we can observe in the real world, that we can't walk into a grocery store and see the entire demand curve. However, we can observe the market price. That's the price that's listed right below the milk. And we can observe the market quantity. We can observe how many gallons of milk were bought and sold in a given month. So when we think about that real value of the market price and we know what the marginal benefit is to consumers, then we can see that for the first, we're going to make some assumptions here, that this demand curve is going to be over relatively few goods. But once again, that's a simplifying assumption, not a critical assumption. It doesn't matter how large Q is, these rules are going to apply. But let's say that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll say that Q star is 5. That we have 5 gallons of milk that are bought and sold, and that for the first unit of milk, the first gallon of milk that is bought, let's say the price of milk is $1, but consumers would be willing to pay, let's go up, let's say that there's somebody out there that really wants milk, and they'd be willing to pay $10 for that first gallon. The second person would demand a little bit less, would value that gallon of milk a little bit less, or we could think of that first individual as being willing to pay less for the second gallon now that they got the first gallon. So maybe it's $7. And for the third, the marginal benefit, how much they're willing to pay, is $4. And we can continue this process on, and we can see that for that first individual, the difference between 10 and 1 is 9, and that is value that they now have that they wouldn't have had they not bought that milk. They were willing to part with $10 for that first gallon of milk. They didn't have to because the market price of milk was $1, and that market price is determined by the intersection of the behavior of all consumers and all producers. And so that difference between $10 and $1 is $9, and that is pure surplus. That is pure value to the consumer, and we refer to the sum of all of these values as consumer surplus, which we abbreviate CS, and that is going to be the sum of all of those differences until the marginal benefit, the willingness to pay for an additional gallon of milk, is exactly equal to the price. It's exactly equal to $1. And this we can go back to, this is an example of the three principles of economics, which Wolfers and Stevenson from University of Michigan point out back in our week 1 videos, that it is going to be rational for market participants, for economic agents, to buy and sell up until the marginal benefit is just equal to the marginal cost. And so for consumers, the marginal benefit here is their demand curve. It's what they're willing to pay, and the marginal cost is going to be the price, what they do pay. And so they are going to create this market quantity by buying milk up until the point that an additional unit of milk would actually be more costly than the value it creates. We can think about the benefit to producers in a very similar way, so I won't spend as much time on this image. However, we will note that, remember, for producers, the supply curve is not equal to the marginal benefit, it's equal to marginal cost. It reflects how much each additional gallon of milk, for example, costs producers to supply. And so remember that market price, this is the one price on the market that anybody looking to buy or sell milk would get it for $1. We're not able to charge Billy $5 and charge Adriana $6. Everybody has to pay the same price, and every producer receives the same price. So when for that first gallon of milk, maybe it was really cheap to produce that first gallon, or maybe there's only one producer out there who is able to supply milk with a superior technology that allows them to supply milk at a very low marginal cost, then if the marginal cost of that first unit of milk is, let's say, 50 cents, then the difference between 50 cents and $1 is going to be profit, is going to be value to that producer. And when we, once again, think of however many goods there are in Q, whatever the market quantity is, and we sum up all of those profits for the producers in that market, then we get a measure of producer surplus, which we'll abbreviate as PS. And so that producer surplus is measuring the welfare benefits to the producers from being able to interact on the market and sell the milk that it costs them 50 cents to produce for $1, which consumers are willing to pay for it. Now you'll notice here that some of the text on this image is a little fuzzy, that there seems to be like a double print here of the copyright information for this image. And that's because I just laid over the image from 2 slides ago with the image from the last slide. And the point of this is to show you that we can combine those two measures. We can overlap them and think about the sum of the total benefit to the consumers, being the consumer surplus, and the total benefit to the producers of being the producer surplus. And this is going to be the total economic surplus, or the total benefits that we are deriving for all market participants, for all buyers and all sellers, by the existence of having this market, by being able to buy and sell. And this triangle, that is the sum of those two smaller triangles, is going to be maximized, is going to be at its largest when we are at the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price, which are derived by the intersection of supply and demand. And so this is really the insight which we can derive from this video as it relates to consumer and producer well-being and to happiness and satisfaction of market participants, be they households, individuals, or companies, that happiness is going to be maximized when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, and bought at the equilibrium price, which sets those two equal. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to play with this model a little bit more. We're going to think about how different market forces, different factors and phenomena that may be occurring in society lead to changes in the entire demand curve or lead to changes in the entire supply curve. And when they do that, what happens to the price which we see at the store or the quantity which is bought and sold, and what happens to this measure of economic benefit of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So this is an important building block video, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper in the videos to come.